She's deaf! Take her! I know you can hear. She's...
The saloon doors of the Rusty Spur swung open with the force of a man possessed by demons. Chen Wei stumbled through, his silk shirt torn at the collar, his queue disheveled, and his eyes burning with the reckless fire of cheap whiskey. The kind of whiskey that made a man forget his worth and his daughters too. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the saloon floor, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits caught between heaven and earth. She's worthless, Chen Wei bellowed, his Mandarin accent thick and broken by alcohol. He slammed a weathered hand against the bar, causing bottles to rattle. Deaf, mute, useless. Who will marry a girl that cannot hear? Who will want such a broken thing? The saloon fell silent. Even the piano player stopped mid-note, his fingers hovering over ivory keys yellowed by years of frontier heat and neglect. In Redemption, Arizona, a town where misfits and dreamers collected like tumbleweeds, it was rare for someone to voice such cruel words so openly. Behind the bar, Old Tom, the bartender with a scarred face and kind eyes, poured another whiskey without comment. He had seen men like Chen Wei before. Proud merchants brought low by bad luck and worse choices, their dignity stripped away one glass at a time. It was then that he walked in. The sun seemed to follow Jack Hollister into the Rusty Spur, casting his shadow long and dangerous across the floorboards. He was the kind of man the territory had learned to fear, a gunslinger with a reputation that preceded him like a low-hanging storm cloud. But his hands, callous and deadly though they were, had saved more lives than they had taken. He wore dust from a 3-day ride in his dark hair, and his eyes held the kind of weariness that only came from a man who had seen too much and loved too little. Jack moved toward the bar with the fluid grace of a predator, his spades jingling softly. He ordered whiskey without looking at the drunk man beside him, but he heard every word. Everyone in Redemption knew Jack Hollister's story. They knew he had a daughter of his own, back east, being raised by his sister after his wife had died in childbirth. He knew what it meant to love someone you could never properly protect. "Where is she?" Jack asked quietly, his voice cutting through Chen Wei's continued drunken lamentations like a knife through burlap. Chen Wei's eyes swam as he focused on the gunslinger. "Who?" "Your daughter." The old man's face contorted with shame and rage. "Home. Locked in her room where she belongs. Where no man will ever see her and know I fathered such a..." Jack Hollister did not wait for the sentence to finish. He placed a coin on the bar, drained his whiskey in one gulp, and turned toward the door. Behind him, Chen Wei cried out, still ranting, still drinking, still drowning in the quicksand of his own despair. The Chen family residence sat on the outskirts of town, a modest adobe building painted a fading yellow, surrounded by a collapsed fence and a garden gone to dust. Jack had learned long ago to read houses. This one told him everything, a man grasping at civilization, failing against the raw brutality of frontier life. He dismounted from his horse, a dark stallion named Storm, and tied him to a post. Before he could reach the door, he heard it, a sound like an angel's weeping, but silent. Through the window, he saw her. She sat on a hard wooden chair, facing the window as if calling to something beyond it. Her hands moved in shapes that he did not understand at first, then recognized as a language all its own. Her hair was long and black as midnight, and her face held a beauty that transcended the crude cruelty her father had spoken. She was perhaps 20, with eyes that held more intelligence and dignity than 100 men who could hear. Her name was Chen Li, and when Jack knocked on the door, she did not startle at the sound. She toned, her dark eyes studying him with the careful precision of someone who had learned to read the world through sight alone. Jack pushed the door open. It was not locked. He suspected the father simply wanted to believe it was. "Hello," he said, speaking slowly, his eyes meeting hers with absolute certainty. "Can you read my lips?" For a moment, she did not move. Then, slowly, she stood. Her hands came together in a question mark against her chest, and her lips parted as if to ask something that words could never capture. Jack took a step inside, his presence seeming to fill the small room with something neither of them could name. "I'm Jack Hollister. I heard your father in the saloon." He was wrong. Lee's eyes moved to his hands, to the guns at his hips, to the dust on his clothes. Fear flickered across her face, but something else too, a hunger for connection, a desperate need to know if this man, this stranger, meant what his face seemed to be saying. Jack sat down slowly in the chair she had vacated, bringing his eyes level with Hayes. He took her hand gently, his rough fingers soft against her delicate palm. "Your father is wrong," he repeated, more deliberate this time. "I can hear you. Watch." He took her hand and placed it against his chest, against his heart. Then he began to move. He stood, and he walked to the corner of the room, and he began to tell her story, not with his lips, not with his voice, but with his entire body. His hands shaped the landscape of his journey. His face showed the pain of loss. His eyes revealed the longing he carried. He moved like a man dancing with invisible partners, like a man who understood that not all language needed sound to be heard. Lee watched, transfixed. Her eyes followed every gesture, every subtle shift in his expression. And slowly, tears began to trace down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from profound realization that someone, finally, had recognized her as human, as worthy, as heard. When Jack stopped, he took both her hands in his. "Can you feel that?" he asked. "That's how I hear you. Every movement, every expression, every moment tells me exactly who you are. And you are extraordinary." In the weeks that followed, Jack Hollister began a courtship that became the talk of redemption, the gunslinger and the deaf merchant's daughter. He would arrive in the evenings with drawings that told stories, with gifts of smooth stones that she could hold and understand the texture of his affection through. He taught her to feel music by placing her hand on the piano at the saloon, letting her sense the vibrations of melodies that had existed beyond her hearing her entire life. Chen Wei, meanwhile, descended further into dissolution. He would rage against Jack, against his daughter, against the God that had made her as she was. The town tolerated his drunken tirades but said nothing. There was something sacred about what was happening between Lee and the gunslinger, something that transcended the ordinary judgments of men. One evening, as the sun set the entire desert aflame with shades of orange and crimson, Jack brought Lee to the ridge overlooking the desert. He had spent the entire day sketching in the date, creating a massive scene that told the story of his love for her. As Lee stood before it, reading his heart written in the earth, he dropped to one knee. He could not ask her to marry him with words. Instead, he drew a simple symbol in the sand, two paths converging into one. Then he took the ring his wife had worn, the ring meant for the daughter back east, and he placed it in the palm of her hand. Lee's entire body went rigid. Her eyes widened, and her hands flew to her mouth. When she looked at him again, he saw something that transcended the barrier of her deafness. He saw recognition, acceptance, love. The wedding took place in Redemption's small church, a simple white building that had once been a trading post. The entire town came, including Chen Wei, who sat in the back pew with a sober face and reddened eyes. Jack had invited him personally, making sure the old merchant knew that he would be welcome, that his daughter's triumph was not his failure. It was his redemption. Lee wore a dress sewn together from the finest fabric the territory could offer, white silk brought from San Francisco, with intricate embroidery at the collar that Jack himself had designed. She walked down the aisle alone, her eyes fixed on Jack with such intensity that everyone in the church felt the force of their connection. When the Reverend asked if anyone objected, the silence that filled the church was absolute and eternal. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Jack drew Lee into his arms and kissed her with the kind of passion that speaks in every language known to mankind. At the wedding reception, held in the Rusty Spur, something miraculous happened. Chen Wei approached his daughter and his new son-in-law, his face a landscape of regret and hope intertwined. He did not speak. Instead, he took his daughter's hands and began to move, clumsily but sincerely, mimicking the gestures she had taught herself to make. "Father," Lee read on his lips, and tears flowed freely down both their faces. Jack placed a hand on the old man's shoulder, a gesture of forgiveness that needed no words, that spoke in the universal language of second chances. 15 years later, the town of Redemption had become known throughout the territory not as a place of outlaws and misfits, but as a place of miracles. Jack Hollister had hung up his guns and become the sheriff, a guardian of law and order. The office walls were decorated with drawings created by his wife, Lee, whose art had become celebrated throughout Arizona, intricate landscapes and portraits that told stories of the deaf woman who had taught a gunslinger how to truly listen. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. The girl, named Emma, had inherited her mother's gift for art and her father's steady gaze. The boys had their father's steady hands and their mother's patience with the world's mysteries. On quiet evenings, when the desert wind whispered through the canyon surrounding Redemption, Lee would sit with her children and teach them the language of hands and hearts. She would tell them, without speaking, the story of a drunken father and a gunslinger who understood that the deepest conversations happen not in the ear, but in the soul. And Jack, watching his family together, would remember the moment he had walked into the rusty spur, the moment he had heard the cruelty of Chen Wei's words, and the moment he had realized that in a world that often failed to hear the voiceless, he had been given the great gift of truly listening. In the Wild West, where violence and desperation often ruled, there existed a love story that proved the most powerful frontier was not one measured in miles, but in the distance a human heart could travel to reach another. It was a distance that Jack Hollister and Chen Li had crossed together, proving to a dusty territory that not all heroism came from guns, and that not all strength came from the sound of a voice. They had built a home together, not in a house, but in a language that only they understood. And in Redemption, Arizona, that was the greatest love story of them all.